The Senate chamber was a cathedral of power. Its high ceilings and heavy velvet drapes swallowing sound and amplifying tension as rows of polished mahogany benches brimmed with reporters, aides, and onlookers whose eyes flickered with anticipation. John Kennedy, the senior senator from Louisiana, sat at the raised dais, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp, like a man who had weathered countless storms and knew how to spot one brewing. While the air hung thick, with the weight of a public hearing poised to turn dramatic. Every cough, rustle of papers, and whispered aside, echoing like a prelude to a clash. At the witness table below, Michelle Obama, the renowned lawyer and former First Lady, leaned forward with her hands clasped tightly around a pen. Her face a mask of determination tinged with disdain, as the room buzzed with an electric charge that settles in when two formidable figures stand on the edge of a verbal duel. Known for her eloquence and commanding presence, Michelle came prepared, her notes meticulously organized and her posture radiating confidence. While Kennedy remained a study in quiet composure, his suit crisp, tie muted blue, and hands resting lightly on a worn leather folder heavy with years. Sensing the stakes, the crowd's murmurs softened as they leaned forward. Pens poised and phones ready, until it began with a sharp, deliberate question, meant not just to probe, but to provoke. Michelle's voice cut through the chamber as she addressed Kennedy directly, questioning with practiced edge how someone with his dated law degree could lecture on modern policy. Her words landing like a well-aimed dart and sending murmurs through the room as reporters scribbled and aides exchanged glances. She paused, eyes locked on Kennedy, then continued with a thinly veiled jab, suggesting that a degree from decades ago hardly signaled expertise today, leaving the chamber holding its breath under the weight of her challenge. Asterisk. Reporters tapped out tweets already framing the exchange as Michelle's bold takedown of an old guard senator, while a few younger aides nodded subtly, their phones buzzing with drafts ready to amplify her point. She leaned back, her expression satisfied, convinced she had landed a decisive blow by casting Kennedy as a relic with dusty, relevant credentials in the fast-paced, forward-thinking world she championed. Kennedy, however, did not move a muscle. His face remained steady and almost serene, as if he had heard the jab 1,000 times before and learned long ago not to take the bait. His hands stayed lightly clasped on the table, his gaze fixed on Michelle, not with anger, but with a calm that was almost unnerving. As the silence stretched, what had seemed like a moment of triumph for Michelle began to feel uneasy. The crowd's anticipation shifting from her attack to his response. Reporters paused their typing. Aides whispered with eyes darting toward Kennedy, waiting for any flicker of discomfort or flash of indignation, but he gave them nothing. His composure became a force that drained the air from Michelle's attack, quietly rewriting the narrative second by second. He tilted his head slightly, a faint trace of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. Not a smirk, but a hint of amusement, like a man who knew something his opponent did not. The chamber, no stranger to verbal sparring, felt different now, as the usual posturing for cameras and sound bites gave way to something deeper and more personal. Michelle's remarks were no longer just a policy disagreement, but a direct challenge to Kennedy's legitimacy, his education, and his very presence in the room, portraying him as a man whose time had passed and whose law degree from a bygone era could not stand in a world of bold reforms and new ideas. While the crowd leaned in, murmurs fading as Kennedy's silence became a statement of its own. Asterisk, he didn't rise to the bait, didn't lash out, and didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he reached for the leather folder on the table, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. The folder, worn yet elegant with edges softened by years of use, was the kind a seasoned lawyer might carry into a courtroom. And as he opened it slowly to reveal a neatly organized stack of papers, its mere presence shifted the room's attention. Reporters craned their necks with pens hovering. Aides exchanged glances, sensing an unexpected move. While Michelle, feeling the shift, pressed harder. Her voice sharper and tinged with impatience as she remarked that the world had moved on and needed fresh perspectives rather than people resting on laurels from an era when typewriters were cutting edge. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, tentative and uncertain. As Kennedy's silence revealed itself not as hesitation, but as a strategy, honed over years of facing opponents who believed they could outtalk him. He pulled a single crisp sheet from the folder, bearing the embossed seal of a federal court, and held it up without flourish, letting its presence speak for itself as the crowd's focus sharpened and Michelle's confidence flickered briefly before she masked it with a tight smile. Kennedy finally spoke, his voice low and steady with a Louisiana drawl that carried both warmth and steel, beginning calmly that he didn't reckon his degree was the real issue. Words simple yet sharp enough to still the room as reporters stopped writing. Aides stopped whispering, and Michelle froze mid-note. As the crowd leaned in, their attention shifting from her earlier flash to his quiet authority. He placed the paper back into the folder and closed it with a soft snap that echoed in the silence, continuing evenly that it wasn't the age of a degree that mattered, but what one did with it. Asterisk the line landed with the force of a gavel, drawing nods from a few onlookers and a murmur of agreement from older members of the audience, who had seen enough of life to know that experience often trumps bravado. Michelle opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, posture relaxed yet eyes sharp, like a lawyer preparing a closing argument, and spoke steadily about spending his life working for people who cared less about what was written on a diploma and more about what was done in their name. The words pivoted the exchange from personal attack to a broader argument about service and results. And the room felt the shift as Kennedy refused to play her game and instead rewrote the rules. Reporters who had been ready to crown Michelle the victor now scribbled notes about Kennedy's response, while aides whispered and reached for their phones, searching for the case hinted at by the paper he had held up. Unsure whether it was a letter or a court ruling, but certain it had changed the room's gravity. Michelle tried to regain her footing by firing off a policy question, yet her earlier jab had lost its sting. And Kennedy answered with the same measured tone, clear and precise, grounded in a deep understanding of the law and its practical impact. He didn't boast or grandstand. His presence did that for him, and the crowd began to see not just a senator, but a man who had earned his place through years of hard work, faced doubters before, and would face them again with the same quiet strength. The confrontation was not over, but Kennedy had set the tone, absorbing the challenge and turning it into an opportunity to reveal who he was through steady resolve rather than bluster. While the paper in his folder, the calm in his voice, and the glint in his eye signaled this was only the beginning. And the hearing room continued to buzz with the aftershock of the opening clash, heavy with unspoken questions about what would come next. Kennedy sat as he had from the start, calm and composed, his folder resting on the table like a quiet promise of more to come. As the stage was set and the world watched, the Senate chamber thrummed with a restless energy that follows a sharp exchange, leaving everyone poised for the next move, while John Kennedy sat at the polished mahogany dais, its surface catching the soft glow of the chandeliers and reflecting the worn outline of his leather folder, a quiet emblem of preparation. His posture remained relaxed, hands resting lightly on the folder, but his eyes carried a glint of steel, like a man who had faced countless battles and knew exactly how to navigate the one unfolding. Across the days, Michelle clutched her pen a fraction tighter, her posture betraying a flicker of unease beneath her polished exterior. As her earlier jab, mocking Kennedy's law degree as a relic of a bygone era, gave way to the realization that his response, a single sheet bearing a federal court seal and a calm, Cutting retort had shifted the room's gravity. The crowd sensed it, murmurs softening as they leaned forward, eyes darting between the two figures, pens poised and phones ready, waiting for the next turn in the high-stakes duel. Reporters scribbled feverishly, aides whispered in hushed tones, and onlookers shifted in their seats as the air thickened with anticipation. Kennedy's silence was not retreat but strategy, honed over years in courtrooms where timing could turn the tide. And the chamber's towering ceilings and heavy velvet drapes seemed to amplify every cough, rustle of paper, and stifled breath. He opened his folder again, the soft creak of leather cutting through the tension like a signal flare, and drew out another document, its edges worn yet pristine, bearing the faint embossing of a legal institution, its presence alone commanding attention. He did not wave it or hold it aloft for effect, but placed it on the table, letting its weight speak for itself as reporters paused mid-typing, pens hovering, and aides craned their necks to glimpse its contents. Michelle's eyes flicked to the document, her confidence faltering for a split second before she masked it with a tight, controlled smile as Kennedy began in his slow, deliberate Louisiana drawl, each word chosen with the precision of a seasoned lawyer who had spent decades measuring the impact of his voice. Asterisk. Kennedy addressed her degree remark directly, saying he reckoned she thought his wasn't much to look at. Before calmly explaining, he wanted to tell her about a case from a few years back. His voice almost conversational, yet heavy enough to hush the chamber and draw every ear toward him. He glanced at the document not because he needed to read it, but to tighten the crowd's focus. His gaze steady on Michelle as she shifted slightly in her seat, her pen tapping against her notes in a subtle sign of mounting pressure. The case he recounted was a small but powerful chapter of his career, one that spoke not to the prestige of a diploma, but to the grit and heart of a man devoted to serving others. Centered on a family-owned grocery store in a rural Louisiana town called Bayou Bend. There, the owner, Henry Thibodeau, faced ruin under a crushing web of federal regulations, having come to Kennedy years earlier with a trembling voice and a livelihood on the brink of collapse. As dense and unforgiving rules threatened to choke his small business with compliance costs far exceeding its modest profits. A situation most lawyers would have turned away from. Asterisk, the case was too small and the payout too meager. But Kennedy took it on anyway, diving into the work with a tenacity that defined him as he spent countless nights poring over legal texts, sifting through stacks of dusty case law, and tracking down a single, obscure precedent, buried in a 1970s ruling that could turn the case in Henry's favor. In court, his argument became a masterclass in precision, weaving rigorous legal reasoning with deep empathy for the human stakes involved. As he did more than argue the law and instead told Henry's story, painting a vivid picture of a man who had built a business through sheer will only to see it threatened by rules he had no hand in writing. Moved by Kennedy's clarity and conviction, the judge ruled in Henry's favor, saving the store, preserving a dozen jobs, and keeping a small community's lifeline intact. As Kennedy recounted the story, his voice remained steady yet rich with feeling, each word landing like a brushstroke on a canvas that depicted service and resolve. And he emphasized softly but firmly that the case was not about him, but about a man who had poured his life into his store, fed his neighbors, and given people a place to gather in hard times, explaining that he did not need a fancy new degree to understand the struggle, only the willingness to listen, dig in, and fight for what was right. His words resonated deeply, striking a chord with older members of the audience who understood that experience often outweighs credentials. As reporters scribbled furiously and shifted their focus from Michelle's earlier attack to Kennedy's grounded narrative, while aides nodded subtly, their phones forgotten, and the chamber, usually a stage for posturing and sound bites, grew heavy with the sense that Kennedy was speaking not just to Michelle, But to everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they did not belong. Michelle, sensing the room slipping from her grasp, tried to pivot, her voice sharpening with a trace of frustration as she acknowledged the story's emotional pull, but argued that a single case did not make Kennedy an expert on today's systemic challenges, insisting that issues like climate, technology, and inequality demanded bold, forward-thinking solutions rather than small-town courtroom anecdotes. It was a calculated attempt to reclaim the narrative of progress and modernity, casting Kennedy as tethered to the past. And a few younger aides nodded while tapping out tweets as reporters jotted her words with renewed vigor, briefly suggesting she might regain momentum. Kennedy, however, did not flinch. He leaned forward slightly, meeting her gaze with quiet confidence, and replied calmly that while he did not claim to know everything about today's world, the people he worked for cared less about trends than about truth, and truth did not expire with a degree. The line rippled through the chamber, drawing murmurs of agreement and impressed glances, as Kennedy transformed a personal attack into a universal truth, speaking for anyone judged by the age of their credentials rather than the depth of their work. Older reporters nodded subtly, recognizing the craft of a man seasoned in courtrooms, as Kennedy placed the document back into his folder and closed it with a deliberate snap, needing no further words as the story had already done its work, revealing a man who had earned his place through steady, unglamorous service to others. The crowd felt the shift, their attention moving from Michelle's earlier bravado to Kennedy's quiet strength, as social media lit up with praise for his resolve and posts, declaring that a man who knows his craft should never be underestimated. Michelle tried to regain her footing by steering the discussion back to policy, her voice sharp but less certain as she flipped through her notes and asked how he proposed to address the complexities of modern regulations affecting millions, not just a single small business. It was a fair question that might have landed earlier, but Kennedy's story had already changed the room's energy, and he answered with calm clarity, grounding his response in the law's practical impact and reinforcing his authority without theatrics, explaining that regulations are only as good as the people they serve, and that reform begins by listening to those affected and building from there. The crowd leaned in, drawn by his ability to make abstract policy human, while reporters who had once leaned toward Michelle now framed Kennedy's reply as a masterclass in turning a personal attack into a broader statement about service. The chamber's buzz shifted into a tone of respect, Kennedy's folder resting on the table like a silent promise of more to come, as Michelle's notes became a flurry of scribbles and the audience's gaze kept returning to Kennedy, the man who had transformed doubt into a testament to character through calm preparation rather than volume or showmanship. Aides whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to search for the case Kennedy had mentioned, curious about the senator who had turned a single document into a moment of authority. And though the hearing continued, the narrative had clearly shifted. Kennedy had set the stage for something bigger, and the room knew it, their attention fixed on him as they waited for his next move. The clash was not over, but Kennedy had made one thing clear: he was in control, armed with the truth of his work and the strength of his convictions. The Senate chamber hummed with charged intensity, the air thick with the aftershock of his measured response to a pointed attack. The polished mahogany dais gleamed under the chamber's chandeliers, casting a soft glow on Kennedy's leather folder, now a silent testament to his preparation and resolve. As he sat unruffled, hands resting lightly on the table, eyes sharp yet warm like a man who had faced fiercer storms and knew exactly how to steer through this one. Across the dais, Michelle gripped her notes, her posture stiffening as a flicker of unease broke through her polished demeanor. Her earlier jab at Kennedy's law degree as a relic of a bygone, era having been firmly countered by his story of a small-town case that saved a family's livelihood, while reporters, aides, and onlookers leaned forward, murmurs fading and eyes darting between the two figures, sensing the confrontation hovering on the edge of something unforgettable. The room, with its towering ceilings and heavy velvet drapes, amplified every sound: a rustle of papers, a stifled cough, a whispered aside as the stage was set for a moment that would redefine the narrative. Kennedy's calm was not merely composure, but a calculated force, honed over years in courtrooms where a single move could shift the balance of a case. And the anticipation was palpable as the crowd waited for him to deliver the next blow in the high-stakes duel. Michelle, sensing the need to reclaim her footing, straightened in her seat, her pen tapping rapidly against her notes as she spoke sharply and deliberately, accusing Kennedy of leaning on stories from the past and arguing that a new era defined by climate change, technological disruption, and systemic inequality demanded bold, forward-thinking solutions rather than nostalgia. Her words were precise, crafted to reframe the debate on her terms and paint Kennedy as tethered to an outdated mindset, prompting a few younger aides to nod as their phones buzzed with draft tweets while reporters scribbled furiously, framing the moment as a clash between progress and tradition. For a brief moment, it seemed she might regain momentum, her passion and clarity recalling her formidable presence. But Kennedy did not budge. His posture relaxed, hands lightly clasped, eyes fixed on her with a steady, non-defensive gaze. As the room felt the weight of his silence, a pause that was not hesitation, but strategy capable of turning a courtroom or a Senate hearing on its head. Kennedy tilted his head slightly, a faint trace of a smile touching his lips. Not a smirk, but a quiet acknowledgement that he was ready for what came next. As he nodded to an aide who stepped forward with a small tablet glinting under the chamber lights, drawing the crowd's curious gaze and signaling that something significant was coming. He accepted the tablet with the same unhurried calm that had defined his presence all day, his fingers moving with the ease of someone who had done this countless times, and spoke in a low, deliberate voice warmed by his Louisiana roots and tempered with the steel of a seasoned advocate, explaining that he had recently heard something at an event that he felt was worth sharing. With a tap on the screen, a large display behind the dais flickered to life, casting a soft glow across the room as the faint hum of a video loading filled the chamber and anticipation spiked. Reporters pausing their typing, aides craning their necks, and even Michelle stilling her pen as her eyes narrowed. The footage began, slightly crackled but clear, revealing a bustling fundraiser where Michelle's own confident voice rang out, praising people who had fought their way up, attended night school, earned degrees through sweat and sacrifice, and brought real perspective that outworked anyone from a fancy university. A line that drew applause and a bright smile from her in the recording. The screen froze on that moment, her expression full of pride and sincerity. And Kennedy let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the chamber like a storm cloud as a soft gasp rippled through the room. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances with fingers hovering over keyboards. Aides whispered and reached for their phones to capture the moment. And Michelle's earlier confidence tightened into unease, her pen motionless, while Kennedy did not rush to speak, letting the silence linger and the contradictions sink in. After letting the silence settle over the contradiction he had just exposed, Kennedy spoke calmly, his eyes locked on Michelle as he noted that her own words praised the very kind of journey she had mocked. People who worked hard earned their place through grit and determination, and built their credentials the hard way, not handed to them. The simple words landed like a thunderclap, surgically revealing the irony in her attack. As the room filled with murmurs and reporters typed furiously, framing the exchange as a masterclass in debate while social media lit up with praise for Kennedy's quiet strength. Michelle tried to recover, insisting he was twisting her words and claiming she meant fresh ideas rather than old credentials. But the shift in the room was unmistakable. Her earlier momentum giving way to Kennedy's deeper authority, rooted in consistency and truth. He waited for her words to fade before replying gently but firmly that he was not twisting anything, only holding up a mirror, reminding the room that hard work mattered and that the focus should be on substance, not noise. The line resonated powerfully, drawing nods and whispers of admiration as Michelle scribbled frantically, struggling to regroup while Kennedy leaned back, composed, his folder resting on the table like a quiet promise. The darkened screen behind him lingered in everyone's mind, and the crowd's attention fully shifted to his substance over her flash, as reporters framed the moment as a turning point. Aides whispered about his preparation, and social media exploded with clips and praise, capturing what many saw as Kennedy calmly playing chess while others played checkers. Asterisk while Michelle played checkers. One widely shared post declared, and another called it the moment a senator showed what real leadership looks like. As the hearing moved on with the energy unmistakably changed. Kennedy sat as he had from the start, calm, composed, and in control, while Michelle, still formidable, now carried the weight of her own words. The tables turned as the world watched and waited for Kennedy's next move. The Senate chamber buzzed with a quiet intensity that lingers when a confrontation reaches its peak and leaves. The room altered. The polished mahogany dais glowing under the chandeliers and reflecting the worn outline of Kennedy's leather folder. Now a symbol of unshakable resolve. Kennedy remained steady, hands loosely clasped, eyes scanning the room with warmth layered over steel. While across the dais Michelle sat with her notes in disarray, her earlier confidence dimmed by the moment. She had opened with a sharp attack on his law degree, but he had answered first with a small-town case that revealed dedication. Then with her own words on video exposing the contradiction, leaving reporters, aides, and onlookers riveted. Murmurs hushed and eyes fixed on Kennedy as he transformed a personal jab into a testament of character. The air grew heavy with the sense that something larger was unfolding, a lesson reaching beyond the chamber, as Kennedy's steady presence reshaped the narrative and the room waited for his final move. Sensing the moment, he adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and spoke calmly yet commandingly, addressing Michelle but speaking to everyone, reflecting on years of debate over degrees and qualifications before concluding that it is not the paper on the wall that defines a person, but the work they do, the people they serve, and the truth they hold to. Words that landed softly yet silenced the chamber as reporters froze mid-typing, recognizing a line destined to echo far beyond the room. Asterisk, he didn't need to raise his voice or rely on theatrics, because his story, his resolve, and his quiet strength spoke for him. Kennedy spoke with calm conviction, recalling how as a young lawyer he took on cases others ignored, proving his worth through action rather than prestige, and reminding the room that true strength is not measured by titles or elite schools, but by showing up every day and fighting for what is right. Placing his hand on his folder, he declared that justice, not privilege, guided him, and his simple yet powerful words silenced the chamber, spread rapidly online, and moved aides, reporters, and onlookers alike. In that moment, Kennedy transformed doubt into a timeless lesson, showing that leadership is built on integrity, resilience, and the courage to let one's work speak louder than words.